"You're under arrest, Ms. Albright." The words, sharp and clear, sliced through the evening air. Officer Miller, his face grim under the brim of his cap, clicked the handcuffs into place around Karen Albright's wrists. Her jaw dropped, her perfectly coiffed hair seeming to deflate along with her self-important posture. Just moments before, she had been preening, a smug look plastered across her face, convinced she had finally won. She had called the police on me, Sarah Jenkins, for the supposed high crime of leaving the HOA. She expected me to crumble, to beg, to be dragged back into her suffocating world of bylaws and busybody regulations. Instead, her world was crumbling around her, and the very officers she summoned were now leading her away. The look of utter shock and disbelief on her face was almost comical, if the situation wasn't so incredibly serious. How did it come to this? How did a simple act of wanting peace lead to an HOA president in handcuffs, hauled away by one of her own neighborhood's finest? Life in the Grandview Estates HOA had not always been this way. When my husband, David, and I first bought our modest ranch-style home here, the community felt like a dream. The streets were lined with blossoming dogwoods, children rode bikes freely, and impromptu block parties were a common occurrence. We moved in with our 2 young boys, 8-year-old Daniel and 6-year-old Michael, eager for a place where they could grow up with a sense of belonging. The HOA, at that time, seemed like a benign entity, a necessary evil for maintaining property values and ensuring the neighborhood remained picturesque. We paid our dues, attended the occasional meeting, and mostly focused on making our house a home. David was a kind, steady presence, a man who believed in quiet acts of service. He was a carpenter, and his hands, though calloused, crafted beautiful things. He built Daniel a treehouse that was the envy of every kid on the block and meticulously repaired anything that broke around the house. I worked part-time as a librarian, a job I loved for its quiet rhythm and the joy of connecting people with stories. Our days were filled with school runs, homework help, laughter, and the occasional sibling squabble. Evenings often found us on our small porch, watching the sunset, sipping iced tea, and listening to the distant sounds of kids playing. Life was simple, full, and content. The first hint of trouble, a faint rumble before the storm, came subtly. It began with an email, innocuous enough, about a new beautification committee being formed. Soon after, another email announced Ms. Karen Albright as its self-appointed head. Karen, who lived in the largest house on the cul-de-sac, was a retired executive, seemingly with an abundance of time and a meticulously organized spreadsheet for every aspect of her life. At first, her initiative seemed harmless. She organized a neighborhood cleanup day, which was genuinely helpful. Then came the uniform mailbox directive. Everyone had to replace their mailbox with a specific, HOA-approved model. It was expensive, and many residents grumbled, but no one wanted to be the first to object. We replaced ours, painting it the exact shade of Grandview gray as mandated. Next, the grass height rule became stricter. Suddenly, if your lawn was a millimeter over the prescribed 3 inches, you received a passive-aggressive notice. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly woman with a vibrant rose garden, got fined because her beloved roses, which grew wonderfully tall, were deemed obstructions to sidewalk visibility. It seemed absurd. David, usually so calm, actually frowned at that one. "Roses are obstructions," he mumbled, shaking his head. "What's next, banning gnomes?" The HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, became battlegrounds. Karen, with her precise diction and an air of unshakable authority, would lecture residents on everything from the color of their porch lights to the type of shrubs they planted. She introduced a good neighbor initiative that, ironically, seemed to cause more animosity than good. Neighbors were encouraged to report violations they observed. It fostered a culture of suspicion, turning friendly waves into wary glances. People started closing their blinds, keeping to themselves. The once vibrant community spirit began to wither under the weight of excessive regulation. One sweltering summer afternoon, a less extreme event occurred that perfectly illustrated the growing absurdity. Daniel, our eldest, had a lemonade stand at the end of our driveway. He had spent hours meticulously setting it up, drawing a colorful sign with huge, bubbly letters, "Lemonade. 50 cents." He was so proud. David had helped him make a huge pitcher, and the tart, sweet smell wafted through the air. Within minutes, 2 cars stopped, and Daniel, beaming, made his first sales. He even gave a free cup to the mailman. It was a simple, innocent childhood rite of passage. Then, a golf cart, meticulously polished, pulled up. It was Karen Albright, wearing a large straw hat and an even larger frown. She looked at Daniel's stand with an expression of profound disapproval, as if he were operating a clandestine moonshine distillery. "Young man," she declared, her voice surprisingly loud, "do you have a permit for this establishment?" Daniel, his smile faltering, looked at me, confused. I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice even. "Karen, it's just a lemonade stand. He's 8 years old. An unlicensed vendor operation on HOA property," she stated, her eyes narrowed. "It's a clear violation of Article 7, subsection B, commercial activities. This cul-de-sac is for residential purposes only. You are setting a dangerous precedent, Sarah." My jaw tightened. Dangerous precedent? It's lemonade. She remained unmoved. "Rules are rules, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm afraid I'll have to issue a notice. And if it happens again, there will be a fine." Daniel, his small shoulders slumped, began to dismantle his stand, his enthusiasm crushed. The joy had been sucked right out of his afternoon. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he whispered, "Mommy, did I do something bad?" It broke my heart. David, witnessing my distress, gently suggested, "Maybe it's time we think about something else, hon, this place, it's changing." His words resonated deeply. The joy we once found in Grandview Estates was slowly being replaced by a nagging sense of being watched, judged, and controlled. We started researching other communities, looking at houses outside the reach of any HOA. It was a big decision, leaving the home we had poured so much love into, but the thought of peace, of freedom from Karen's arbitrary rules, was increasingly appealing. Then came the incident that truly pushed us to our breaking point, an event far more extreme than a crushed lemonade dream. It started innocently enough, a beautiful spring morning. David had planned a surprise for Michael, a small, inflatable pool for him and his friends to splash around in. It was a hot day, and Michael had been begging for a pool all week. David spent the morning inflating it in the backyard, filling it with cool water. The boys, along with 2 of their friends from down the street, were shrieking with delight, splashing and playing, their laughter echoing through our yard. It was a perfect summer scene. Suddenly, a piercing siren erupted from the street. Not an emergency siren, but a shrill, insistent wail that cut through the joyful sounds of children. It grew louder, closer, and then stopped right in front of our house. Through the front window, I saw it, a massive, bright yellow tow truck, its hazard lights flashing, slowly backing up our driveway. And standing beside it, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk on her face, was Karen Albright. Behind her, a stern-faced man in a uniform, clutching a clipboard. It wasn't the police, but someone equally intimidating in that moment, an HOA compliance officer. The sight sent a cold shiver down my spine. This was not a warning, this was an immediate, aggressive escalation. The tow truck's engine rumbled ominously, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of our home. Karen's smirk widened as the compliance officer, a burly man with a clipped mustache, approached our front door. He held up his clipboard, his finger already pointing to a section. "Mrs. Jenkins," he began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, we have received a complaint regarding an unauthorized recreational water feature. Specifically, an inflatable pool exceeding the dimensions permitted by HOA bylaws. My mind reeled. An inflatable pool? Unauthorized? My boys' excited splashes had turned into confused silence from the backyard. David, who had heard the commotion, stepped out from behind me, his face etched with concern. "Officer," he said, trying to maintain a calm tone, "it's a small pool for the kids. It's not a permanent structure." Karen, from her perch beside the tow truck, interjected, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. Article 9, Section C, Temporary Structures and Recreational Equipment. Any water-holding apparatus exceeding 50 gallons requires prior written approval from the HOA board, along with a detailed safety plan and proof of liability insurance. Furthermore, it explicitly states, no inflatable pools of any size are permitted in visible areas of any property at any time. She recited it like a seasoned lawyer, every word punctuated by a nod of her head. The compliance officer cleared his throat. "She's correct, sir. The dimensions of this particular pool, from what I've been informed, vastly exceed the maximum permitted for a child's wading toy. You have two options: immediate removal, or we will have it removed and you will be assessed a fine for non-compliance and removal services." David clenched his fists, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. "You're going to tow a child's pool?" he asked, incredulous. "It's about upholding community standards, Mr. Jenkins," Karen chirped. "We can't have the neighborhood looking like a public swimming hole." The boys, drawn by the unusual silence from the adults, slowly emerged from the backyard, their eyes wide with worry. Michael, seeing the tow truck, looked up at David, his lips trembling. "Daddy, what's happening to our pool?" My heart ached. This wasn't about rules, it was about power, about Karen's need for control, and about crushing any spark of joy that didn't fit into her rigid vision. "Karen," I said, my voice low and steady, "you know this is ridiculous. This is harassment." "It's enforcement," she retorted, puffing out her chest. "And if you resist, it will be considered obstruction." David, seeing the distress on Michael's face, knew he had to de-escalate. With a heavy sigh, he turned to the compliance officer. "Fine. We'll drain it and take it down. Just, give us a moment." The officer nodded curtly, and Karen, though clearly disappointed she wouldn't see the tow truck in action, settled back, watching us like a hawk. It took us over an hour to drain the water and wrestle the large, deflated pool into our shed. The boys were quiet, their afternoon ruined, their innocent fun replaced by a stark lesson in arbitrary authority. That evening, as we ate dinner, a somber mood hung over the table. Daniel, usually so chatty, picked at his food. "Why do we have to live here, Mom?" he asked, his voice small. That was the night David and I officially decided. We were leaving the HOA. We started the process of looking for a new house in earnest, prioritizing communities with no HOA restrictions. It was a long, arduous process. Selling a house, especially with two active boys, felt like a monumental task. We had to fix small things, paint walls, and keep the house meticulously clean for showings. Every time a new HOA notice arrived, a warning about a stray toy left in the driveway, a reminder about trash can placement, it fueled our determination. A less extreme event, though still grating, occurred during this period. We had put a small, "For Sale" sign in our front yard, a standard, tasteful sign from our real estate agent. The very next morning, we found an official HOA notice of violation taped to our front door. The violation? Unauthorized signage. I called the HOA office, bewildered. It's a "For Sale" sign. How can that be unauthorized? The stern voice on the other end, clearly an employee trained by Karen, calmly recited, "All external signage, including for sale signs, must adhere to HOA-approved dimensions, colors, and placement specifications. Furthermore, a permit must be obtained and a fee paid for such signage to be displayed. This was a new rule, obviously concocted to make selling property within the HOA more difficult, or perhaps just to exert more control. We had to remove our agent's sign and purchase a generic, tiny white sign with black lettering from the HOA office itself, at an inflated price, of course. It felt like they were deliberately trying to impede our escape. Weeks turned into months. The stress of selling, coupled with the constant low-level harassment from Karen and her increasingly draconian rules, wore us down. We received fines for everything from improper shrub maintenance, despite our shrubs being perfectly trimmed, to unapproved window treatments, because Michael had hung a poster of a superhero in his bedroom window. Each fine, each notice, was a tiny chip away at our patience, at our peace. Then, one glorious Tuesday, it happened. We received an offer on our house, a good offer, from a lovely young couple who seemed genuinely excited about the neighborhood. We accepted it, practically leaping with joy. The closing date was set for 2 weeks out. We were finally free. We told the boys the good news that night, and Daniel actually cheered, while Michael did a happy dance around the kitchen. The weight lifted from our shoulders was immense. We spent the next 2 weeks packing, a whirlwind of boxes and bubble wrap, dreaming of a life free from HOA tyranny. On the morning of the closing, after signing the last of the endless documents and officially handing over the keys, a profound sense of relief washed over me. We were done. We were out. We packed the last few items into our car, the boys practically vibrating with excitement. As we pulled out of the driveway, I looked back at our old house, no longer burdened by the thought of Karen's watchful eye. It was truly over. Or so I thought. We had just settled into our new, blissfully HOA-free home, a charming house on a quiet street with a big backyard and not a single rule about grass height, when the truly extreme event occurred. It was a lazy Saturday morning. David was grilling burgers, the smell wafting deliciously through the air. The boys were playing catch in the yard, their laughter echoing freely. It felt like paradise. The doorbell rang, a cheerful chime. I opened it, expecting a delivery or perhaps a new neighbor. Instead, standing on my porch, dressed impeccably as always, was Karen Albright. And beside her, 2 police officers. One of them was a young man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm, observant gaze. The other, an older, grizzled officer, looked directly at me. "Sarah Jenkins?" The older officer asked, his voice stern. "Yes?" I replied, my heart suddenly thumping in my chest. What could this possibly be about? We had left the HOA. We had sold our house. "We've received a formal complaint from Ms. Albright here," he continued, gesturing to Karen, who was practically vibrating with malicious glee. "She states you are in violation of Grandview Estates HOA bylaws and are refusing to pay outstanding fines and a mandatory exit fee, which she claims is substantial. She's alleging fraud and theft of HOA property." My jaw dropped. Fraud? Theft? We paid every single fine, and there was no exit fee in the bylaws when we bought our house, or when we left. Karen stepped forward, her voice saccharine sweet. "Oh, but there is now, Sarah. A special assessment for disruptive departure costs. You simply chose to ignore it. And those old bylaws? They've been updated. And several of your past violations have been reassessed." The younger officer, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward then, his eyes fixed on Karen. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, passed across his face. He looked at me, then back at Karen, a slight frown forming on his brow. Karen, too engrossed in her triumph, didn't seem to notice. The older officer, however, was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Ma'am," he began, "we're going to have to take you down to the station for questioning regarding these outstanding charges and the alleged refusal to comply with community governance." That's when the young officer spoke, his voice calm and clear, but with an underlying steel that made both the older officer and Karen pause. "Hold on, Officer Thompson." He turned directly to Karen, his gaze unwavering. "Ms. Albright, are you absolutely certain about these new bylaws and these reassessed violations? Because I have a very good memory of the Grandview Estates HOA rules." He then turned to me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Mom?" The word hung in the air, a stunning, unexpected revelation. Karen's triumphant expression froze. The older officer's hand stopped mid-air. My own breath hitched. Michael, hearing the commotion, appeared at the front door, looking confused. Daniel, my son, my eldest son, was standing on my porch, in a police uniform, looking directly at the woman who had tormented our family for years, the woman who was now trying to have his mother arrested. The air crackled with a sudden, electrifying tension. Karen's face, which moments ago had been alight with victory, began to drain of all color, as if she had just seen a ghost. Karen Albright stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes darting between Daniel and me. Her face, usually so composed, crumpled with dawning horror. The older officer, Thompson, looked from Daniel to me, then back to Karen, a slow realization dawning on his face as well. He quickly lowered his hand, the handcuffs no longer looking quite so threatening. "Daniel?" Karen finally managed to squeak, her voice barely a whisper, completely devoid of its usual authority. My son, Officer Daniel Jenkins, met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Ms. Albright. And this is my mom, Sarah Jenkins. The one you just accused of fraud and theft." His tone was calm, yet it carried an undeniable weight. It wasn't the voice of a child who had his lemonade stand shut down, but of a man, a police officer, who understood the intricacies of law and justice. Officer Thompson, clearly sensing the shift in dynamic, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Officer Jenkins, I wasn't aware this was your family." Daniel nodded. "It is, sir. And I'm also very familiar with the Grandview Estates HOA bylaws. I grew up there. I assure you, my parents complied with every single rule and regulation, often under duress. There were no exit fees when they moved, nor any legitimate basis for these reassessed fines." He paused, his gaze hardening as it settled on Karen. "In fact, Ms. Albright, what you're doing right now could be considered filing a false police report, which, as you know, is a serious offense." Karen's face went from pale to ashen. She took an involuntary step backward. No, I misunderstood. There were new updates. I was simply trying to enforce the rules for the good of the community." Her voice had lost its authoritative edge, replaced by a desperate, fumbling attempt at damage control. "Enforce rules that don't exist, Ms. Albright?" Daniel's voice remained steady. "Or perhaps, rules you fabricated to harass a family who simply wanted to leave your association?" He turned to Officer Thompson. "Sir, I recommend we review the official HOA documents. I can attest that my parents fulfilled all their obligations when they sold their property. This complaint appears to be without merit, and potentially, malicious." Officer Thompson, a veteran of many neighborhood disputes, quickly assessed the situation. He recognized the shift, the sudden vulnerability of the accuser. He looked at Karen with a new, less patient expression. "Ms. Albright, this is a serious accusation. If what Officer Jenkins says is true, you could be facing charges yourself." He then turned to Daniel. "Officer Jenkins, perhaps you could provide us with a summary of the relevant bylaws you're aware of, specifically regarding exit fees or reassessed violations for former residents." Daniel nodded. "I can do better than that, sir. My parents kept meticulous records of every single HOA notice, every payment, and every official bylaw amendment they ever received. They were always very careful to adhere to the rules, no matter how unreasonable. He glanced at me, a silent message of reassurance passing between us. If you'll give me a moment, I can access those records for you. He then subtly motioned for Officer Thompson to step aside for a private word, leaving Karen to stew in her growing discomfort. While they conversed in hushed tones a few feet away, Karen began to fidget, her eyes darting around our street as if searching for an escape route. Her confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a visible panic. She tried to make eye contact with me, perhaps seeking some form of sympathy, but I simply stared back, a lifetime of suppressed frustration and hurt bubbling to the surface. It was a less extreme moment for her, certainly, but for me, it was a profound shift in power, a quiet victory after years of being on the defensive. David, who had come out to the porch and had been silently observing the entire exchange, now stepped forward. He put a comforting hand on my shoulder. Michael, still slightly bewildered, clutched at David's leg. Daniel, finished with his conversation with Officer Thompson, returned, a serious expression on his face. "Ms. Albright," Daniel stated, his voice ringing with authority. "Based on our preliminary review and my own knowledge of the HOA's historical bylaws, there is no provision for a disruptive departure cost or any exit fee for residents leaving the HOA. Furthermore, any reassessment of past, paid violations after a property has been sold is legally dubious and not supported by any official documentation my parents ever received or that I recall. What you have done here is brought forward a complaint without a lawful basis." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Daniel held up a hand, stopping her. "Furthermore, Ms. Albright, due to the nature of your complaint and the apparent lack of substantiating evidence, coupled with the potential for this to be considered a malicious act, we are now required to take further action." He paused, and the air thickened with suspense. Karen's eyes widened, fear now plainly visible. Officer Thompson stepped forward, no longer looking awkward, but professional and resolute. "Ms. Albright," Officer Thompson began, his voice firm, "you are being placed under arrest for filing a false police report and harassment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Karen's face crumpled completely. "Arrest? This is absurd. I'm the HOA president. You can't arrest me." Her voice rose in a frantic, almost desperate plea. But Daniel, my son, stepped forward, his hand reaching for her arm. This was the truly extreme moment, the crescendo of years of low-level tyranny meeting its unexpected and shocking end. The click of the handcuffs, sharp and definitive, echoed through the quiet suburban street. Karen Albright, the formidable HOA Karen, the woman who had made our lives a misery, was now standing on our porch, in handcuffs, being arrested by my own son. Her face was a mask of disbelief, then humiliation, as Daniel, with professional detachment, began to lead her towards the police cruiser parked at the curb. The tables had turned in a way none of us could have ever predicted. The sight of Karen Albright, handcuffed and being led away by Daniel, was surreal. Neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights of the police cruiser, began to emerge from their homes, their faces a mixture of confusion and open-mouthed astonishment. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, "Is that Karen Albright? What happened? Are they arresting her?" It was an extreme event, a public downfall that many in Grandview Estates, even those who feigned politeness, had secretly wished for. Daniel remained professional, his expression stoic, as he guided Karen towards the back of the patrol car. Officer Thompson opened the door, and Karen, clearly trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, stumbled slightly as she was helped inside. The door clicked shut, sealing her fate for the moment. As the patrol car pulled away, its blue and red lights painting fading streaks across the dusk, a strange silence descended upon our street. It wasn't the oppressive silence of fear that Karen's presence often brought, but a stunned, almost reverent quiet. Daniel turned and walked back towards us, the weight of his uniform somehow more pronounced now. He looked at me, a flicker of something soft, almost apologetic, in his eyes. "Mom," he began, his voice lower now, for our ears only, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I wish I'd known she was doing this." I reached out and squeezed his arm. "Daniel, you didn't know. And you handled it perfectly. I'm just stunned. And incredibly proud of you." David stepped forward and clapped Daniel on the back. "Son, that was incredible. You truly have a good head on your shoulders." Michael, still clinging to David's leg, finally piped up, his eyes wide. "Daniel, are you going to put bad guys in jail now?" Daniel managed a small, tired smile. "Something like that, Mikey. Sometimes the bad guys are just people who get a little too carried away with rules." He looked around at our new, peaceful yard, then back at our faces. "This is a good place, Mom. No HOA, right?" "No HOA, honey," I confirmed, a profound sense of relief washing over me. "Just us." Officer Thompson returned to our porch, carrying his clipboard. "Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Jenkins, we'll need to get your official statements at the station tomorrow, just to finalize the report. Officer Jenkins can explain the process. We'll also need the records of your HOA payments and any bylaw amendments you have," which he mentioned. He paused, looking at Daniel. "You did good, Jenkins. Real good." Daniel nodded, a hint of pride in his posture. "Thank you, sir." After Officer Thompson left, the weight of the day truly settled in. We still had to process what had just happened. It was a less extreme event, but a necessary one, the quiet aftermath. We sat on our new porch, the sounds of crickets filling the air, and slowly, carefully, recounted the long history of our dealings with Karen Albright, from the mailbox mandates to the crushed lemonade stand, the tow truck incident, and the absurd "for sale" sign rule. Daniel listened patiently, his expression shifting from empathy to controlled anger as he heard the full scope of her harassment. "It's just. She had so much control," I explained, my voice tinged with the lingering frustration. "And she wielded it like a weapon. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice anymore, it was about power, about making everyone conform to her idea of perfect." David added, "We tried to be good neighbors. We tried to follow the rules. But it was never enough. It felt like she was looking for reasons to find fault." Daniel finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. "That kind of behavior, that abuse of power, it erodes trust. It breaks down communities, instead of building them up. It's why people need to be able to stand up, to speak out, even when it's hard." He looked at Michael, who was now quietly playing with a toy car. "It's also why empathy is so important. People like Karen, they often don't see the impact of their actions on others. They get so caught up in their own perceived authority or vision, they forget about kindness." We talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing easily now that the immediate crisis was over. It was a release, a chance to finally articulate the frustrations we had held inside for so long. Daniel assured us that a false police report was a serious charge, especially when made against former residents without any legal standing. He explained that her actions could lead to significant legal consequences for her, far beyond just embarrassment. He also mentioned that his captain would likely be very interested in this case, given its unusual nature and the clear abuse of process. This discussion, though serious, was a calm before another storm, a moment of reflection and explanation. The next morning, Daniel accompanied us to the police station to give our official statements. It was a formal process, but having him there made it feel less intimidating. We laid out the timeline of events, provided copies of all the HOA notices, fines, and even the ridiculous, official, HOA-approved, for sale, sign. The detective taking our statement listened intently, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. It was clear Karen Albright had severely overstepped. As we were leaving the station, a less extreme event occurred, but one that highlighted the far-reaching consequences of Karen's actions. We ran into Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor from Grandview Estates, the one whose roses had been deemed obstructions. She recognized Daniel in his uniform and her eyes widened. "Officer Jenkins," she exclaimed, then looked at me. "Sarah. What's going on? We heard rumors about Karen. Is it true?" I nodded gently. "She was arrested, Mrs. Henderson. For filing a false report against us." Mrs. Henderson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, bless you. You stood up to her." I just couldn't. "She fined me for my roses, you know. My beautiful roses. Said they were a hazard. This whole neighborhood has been walking on eggshells because of her." Tears welled in her eyes. "She's made so many people miserable. Always finding fault, always judging." Daniel stepped forward. "Mrs. Henderson, if you or any other residents have experienced similar harassment or believe you've been unfairly fined or treated, please consider coming forward. Abuse of power, even in an HOA, needs to be addressed." Mrs. Henderson looked at him, then at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. You think things could change?" "They have to," I said, a newfound resolve in my voice. "For the sake of everyone who still lives there." That encounter solidified something for us. This wasn't just about our family and Karen anymore. It was about the community, about the ripple effect of one person's unchecked authority. Karen's actions had not just affected us, they had created a climate of fear and unhappiness for many. Later that week, another extreme event unfolded, though we only heard about it secondhand, through the neighborhood grapevine. News travels fast in small communities, especially when the HOA president is involved in a public arrest. We received a call from a former neighbor, a kind woman named Brenda, who had always been discreetly sympathetic to our plight. "Sarah, you won't believe it," Brenda exclaimed, her voice buzzing with excitement. "After what happened with Karen, people are finally talking. Someone called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. They're demanding a full audit of the finances and a review of all the new bylaws Karen put into place. Apparently, a lot of those rules she cited for fines, including your exit fee, were never actually voted on by the board or properly ratified by the members. She was just making them up as she went along, or pushing them through without proper procedure." My blood ran cold. She wasn't just abusing existing power, she was creating non-existent rules to exert even more control. It was a level of manipulation we hadn't fully comprehended. Brenda continued, her voice full of newfound determination. "People are so angry, Sarah. They feel tricked, taken advantage of. There's a huge movement to vote her out, to dissolve the beautification committee, and to try and get the old, reasonable rules back. Some people are even talking about a class action lawsuit to recover unjust fines. Your son, Officer Jenkins, he opened everyone's eyes. You started something, Sarah. Something big." The news was exhilarating, yet sobering. It was satisfying to know that Karen's reign was crumbling, but it also underscored the depth of the deception and control she had exerted. The implications of her actions were far greater than just the personal vendetta she had against us. This was going to be a massive overhaul for Grandview Estates, and it was all triggered by one homeowner's courage, one police officer's integrity, and a single, unexpected arrest. The full extent of her deception was beginning to unravel, piece by shocking piece. The days following Karen Albright's arrest were a whirlwind of official procedures and an unexpected outpouring of community support. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from former Grandview Estates neighbors, many of whom I hadn't spoken to in years. They shared their own stories of harassment, exorbitant fines, and rules that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was a less extreme event, but deeply validating, to hear that our family wasn't alone in feeling targeted. Mrs. Henderson even sent a small bouquet of roses, carefully pruned from her thriving garden, with a card that simply read, "Thank you for the courage." It felt like a small, beautiful act of defiance, a quiet reclaiming of joy in a neighborhood that had been stifled for too long. Daniel, meanwhile, was diligently working with the police department and the district attorney's office. He explained that a false police report, especially one made with malicious intent to harass, carried significant penalties. The fact that Karen had attempted to use the police force to enforce fabricated rules against a former resident, and accused them of fraud and theft, made the case even more serious. The police were taking it very seriously, not just for our sake, but to uphold the integrity of law enforcement itself. It sets a dangerous precedent if someone can just call us up and make up charges because they don't like someone, Daniel explained during one of our calls. It wastes resources and undermines public trust. This isn't just about Mom, it's about making sure justice is applied fairly to everyone, and that people understand the consequences of their actions. His dedication to his job, and his quiet determination to see justice served, filled me with immense pride. The news from Grandview Estates continued to filter through Brenda and other former neighbors. The emergency HOA meeting Brenda mentioned had indeed been fiery. Residents, emboldened by Karen's public downfall, spoke out, sharing their grievances. It turned out that many of the new bylaws Karen had implemented, like the infamous exit fee and several new fine structures, had either never been properly voted on by the board or approved by the general membership. She had simply announced them as ratified rules, relying on people's fear of confrontation and their general unfamiliarity with HOA legalities. This discovery ignited a full-blown rebellion. The most extreme event of this period, however, wasn't a public spectacle like Karen's arrest, but a quiet, insidious one that came to light during the ongoing investigation. Daniel called me late one evening, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mom," he said, "I have some disturbing news. The detectives investigating Karen's case, they've uncovered something else during the financial audit of the HOA." My heart pounded. "What is it, Daniel?" "It appears," he continued, "that some of those reassessed fines and fees she was collecting, particularly from residents she had a personal vendetta against, or who questioned her authority, a significant portion of that money didn't make it into the HOA's official accounts. It seems she was diverting it." My breath hitched. "Diverting it? You mean, stealing?" "That's what it looks like, Mom," Daniel confirmed, his voice grim. "It's not just false reports and harassment anymore. They're looking at potential embezzlement. It wasn't just about control, it was about profit too. The disruptive departure costs she tried to pin on you, the exorbitant fees for the HOA-approved signs, the fines for minor infractions that escalated suddenly, it all adds up. It seems some of those funds were going directly into her personal accounts." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Embezzlement. It was one thing to be a controlling busybody, but to actively steal from your neighbors, from the very community you claimed to serve, was a betrayal on a whole new level. It explained the increasingly aggressive and punitive nature of her fines, the sudden appearance of obscure, expensive rules. She wasn't just enforcing, she was enriching herself. The Good Neighbor initiative, designed to encourage reporting violations, suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. She was essentially incentivizing neighbors to help her find new revenue streams for her own pockets. This discovery escalated the legal proceedings against Karen significantly. What started as a single charge of filing a false police report morphed into a complex investigation involving financial fraud. The district attorney's office became deeply involved. The news spread like wildfire through Grandview Estates, confirming the worst suspicions of many residents. The anger intensified, and the calls for accountability grew louder. It also became clear that Karen had operated with little oversight, largely because she had cultivated an environment of fear. People were afraid to challenge her, afraid of the fines, the public shaming, the constant scrutiny. Her iron grip on the HOA board, by intimidation or by simply exhausting any opposition, had allowed her to operate with impunity for far too long. The story was no longer just about us leaving the HOA, it had become a much larger narrative about unchecked power, financial malfeasance, and the importance of holding community leaders accountable. It was a difficult truth, realizing the depth of her deception, but also strangely empowering. It reinforced the message of kindness and empathy, not just as ideals, but as crucial defenses against such abuses. When people forget empathy, when they prioritize control or personal gain over the well-being of others, that's when true harm occurs. The legal system moved slowly, but surely. Karen was officially charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, in addition to the initial charge of filing a false police report. Her perfect, controlled world was unraveling, not just personally, but legally, with severe implications. The media, catching wind of a community leader facing such serious charges, began to take interest. This was no longer just a local dispute, it was becoming a public story about a shocking breach of trust. The next phase, we knew, would involve court appearances and the full weight of the legal system bearing down on Karen. The news of Karen Albright's charges, particularly the embezzlement, sent shockwaves not just through Grandview Estates, but further afield. Local news outlets picked up the story, intrigued by the downfall of a seemingly powerful HOA president. Her face, once a symbol of rigid control, was now plastered across headlines, accompanied by unflattering mugshots. For us, it was a less extreme period of waiting, a quiet anticipation of justice. Daniel kept us informed, explaining the complexities of the legal process, the gathering of evidence, and the preparations for trial. He mentioned that the sheer volume of complaints and financial discrepancies found by the auditors was overwhelming, and it was clear that Karen had been operating her schemes for years. The Grandview Estates HOA itself was in turmoil. An interim board was appointed, and they immediately began the arduous task of unraveling Karen's tangled web of fabricated rules and mismanaged funds. Residents who had quietly suffered for years found their voices, sharing their stories of bullying and unfair treatment. Class action lawsuits were being discussed, aiming to reclaim thousands of dollars in unjust fines. The very fabric of the community, once strained by Karen's oppressive rule, was now undergoing a painful but necessary process of healing and rebuilding. It was inspiring to see people come together, not in fear, but in solidarity, determined to reclaim their neighborhood from the shadows of her tyranny. Then came the day of Karen's preliminary hearing. Daniel, while not directly involved in the prosecution, was present as a police officer and as a supportive son. David and I also attended, along with a surprising number of former Grandview Estates residents, eager to witness the proceedings. Karen, looking significantly less polished than her usual self, sat beside her lawyer, her face pale and drawn. She avoided eye contact with anyone from the community, her usual haughty demeanor replaced by a nervous fidgeting. The prosecution laid out their initial case, detailing the false police report against us, the fabricated HOA rules, and the extensive evidence of diverted funds from the HOA accounts into Karen's personal ones. Documents, spreadsheets, and witness testimonies were presented. It was a methodical, damning presentation that painted a clear picture of calculated deception and abuse of power. The judge listened intently, occasionally interjecting with sharp questions. During a recess, a truly extreme and unexpected event unfolded. As Karen was being escorted out of the courtroom, she suddenly wrenched free from her lawyer's grasp, her eyes wild. She spotted me across the crowded hallway and, with a guttural cry, lunged forward. "You! This is all your fault, Sarah Jenkins," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the marble halls. "You ruined everything. You were supposed to be controlled. You were supposed to stay in line." Before anyone could react, Daniel, who was standing closest to me, reacted instantly. With a swift, practiced movement, he stepped in front of me, shielding me from her desperate lunge. Karen, fueled by a mixture of rage and desperation, bounced off his solid frame, stumbling backward. In the chaos, she tripped over her own feet, collapsing onto the polished floor with a sickening thud. The entire hallway went silent. Security personnel rushed forward, quickly restraining Karen, who was now sobbing uncontrollably, railing against me, Daniel, and the injustice of it all. It was a raw, unfiltered display of her unraveling, a dramatic public breakdown that sealed her fate in the eyes of many. She wasn't just facing legal charges, she was publicly unmasked, her carefully constructed facade of control crumbling to dust. The judge, upon hearing about the incident, immediately issued a stronger restraining order against Karen, preventing her from any contact with us. This erratic behavior also seriously damaged her credibility in the eyes of the court and the public. Her lawyer looked utterly defeated, realizing that his client's outburst had likely prejudiced her case significantly. The trial itself was a prolonged process, but the outcome seemed increasingly inevitable. Witness after witness testified to Karen's bullying, her arbitrary fines, and the financial discrepancies. Former HOA board members, once intimidated into silence, bravely came forward with their own accounts of her manipulative tactics and how she bypassed proper procedures. The overwhelming evidence of embezzlement, coupled with the proven false police report against us, built an undeniable case. Then came the day of the verdict, the ultimate extreme event, the final culmination of this long, arduous journey. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with anticipation. Karen, looking small and defeated, stood beside her lawyer. The judge, his voice clear and resonant, delivered the verdict. On the charges of filing a false police report, harassment, multiple counts of fraud, and embezzlement, he intoned, "This court finds Ms. Karen Albright." A profound silence descended, broken only by the rapid clicks of camera shutters. Everyone leaned forward, holding their breath. Guilty on all counts. A collective gasp, then a quiet ripple of relief and satisfaction, spread through the courtroom. Karen's face, already devoid of color, seemed to completely collapse. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, but she barely seemed to register it. It was over. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood, who had wielded rules like weapons and stolen from her community, was finally held accountable. Later, the judge sentenced her to a significant prison term, along with substantial fines and restitution to the HOA and the residents she had defrauded. It was a stark, undeniable consequence for her actions. As we walked out of the courthouse, the setting sun casting long shadows, a sense of profound peace settled over me. It wasn't about revenge, but about justice. David put his arm around me, and Michael, holding my hand, looked up, his eyes bright. Daniel, standing tall in his uniform, looked at us, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "It's finally over, Mom," he said, his voice gentle. I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yes, Daniel. It is." The story of the HOA Karen became a legend in Grandview Estates, a cautionary tale about unchecked power and the importance of speaking up. And for us, it was a testament to resilience, to the quiet strength of kindness, and to the unwavering bond of family. We had left the HOA, but in doing so, we had inadvertently helped liberate an entire community. And it all began with a desperate, malicious phone call to the police, which ultimately led to the very person making the call being put in handcuffs by her victim's own son. A wild ending indeed.